How's it going, Eliminators? Today, we're going to be using the Induction Innovations Venom HP induction heating tool to try and remove a seized wheel off of a snowblower axle. So with that being said, let's get right into it. So I recently had one of my customers bring in this wheel and axle assembly here out of a Craftsman snowblower. And if you guys are familiar with my videos, I do a lot of seasonal work. So with the transition into winter, we're starting to work on snowblowers, and a seized wheel on an axle is a very common issue on a lot of snowblowers. Now, roughly 2 years ago, almost to the day, I posted a video on how to service a snowblower. Basically just showing you guys the basic things you want to do in terms of maintenance, what to look for when servicing your snowblower. In that video, that snowblower had one of the wheels seized to the axle. The other wheel, however, was able to slide off, and we applied some nickel anti-seize to the axle. And what that's going to do is it's going to prevent what's happened here, which is the wheel seizing to the axle itself. Now, because the wheel and the axle spin together, there is always going to be contact between the axle and the wheel, which means you don't really want to use a lubricant. Instead, you want to use something like an anti-seize, and I use nickel anti-seize, which has prevented wheels from seizing to the axle. As you guys can see here, the wheel on this side slid off. And that's going to be super important for what we're going to talk about next. Snowblowers use what are known as bushings, which are basically just parts that the axle is going to spin in. A drive axle is most likely going to have metal bushings, where something that has a lot less pressure on it is going to have something like a plastic bushing, as you guys can see there. The axle slides into them. This would sit in the chassis or the frame of your snowblower, and then the axle just spins on that. So it would be important to use a little bit of lubricant inside of these bushings. However, the point that I wanted to make is the bushings go inside and then the wheel goes after it. So, as you guys could imagine, you cannot remove both of the wheels. You will not be able to have access at your wheel bushings, so you will not be able to remove them and replace them when they get worn out. So as I said in that how to service a snowblower video, removing one wheel, even if the other wheel is seized, will allow you to then remove the bushing from the one side, unbolt the gear or the sprocket, and then slide the axle out the other side, giving you access at the bushing that has the seized wheel on it. So that's exactly what happened in this situation here. My customer basically was able to get one wheel off, pulled the bushing off, unbolted the gear, slid the axle out, replaced the other bushing as well as this one on this side, and then brought this to me to see if we can get that wheel unseized. So in today's video, we will be using the Mini-Ductor Venom HP induction heating tool to heat up the wheel and try our best to get this wheel unseized from the axle. Once again, big shout out goes to Induction Innovations for sending this product our way. And if you guys want to check out the unboxing and demonstration as well as explanation on how exactly this product works, you can click on the top right of your screen, as well as check out the description down below. I'll have the link to that video there. Now, before we get started, I would like to explain one thing. There's all kinds of coils that we can use on that Mini-Ductor. However, because this axle has been removed from the unit, it would be very easy for me to use one of the preformed coils and bend the end just like that and slide the preformed coil over the axle, then put it into the vise, and then heat up the inner edge of that wheel right there on the axle. That could be done very easily. However, I would like to try to simulate this axle and wheel assembly being seized as if it was still on a snowblower. So we wouldn't have the ability to go in from that way. So with the bearing buddy, which comes supplied with the Mini-Ductor Venom HP, check out the length we have here. You would absolutely be able to use this coil on the wheel if the wheel was seized to the axle and the axle was still on the snowblower. So I might try this out first. And as you guys know, there's no trickery here on my channel, so while my vise moves a little bit because we have to redo the bolts on the workbench, I'm going to grab a hold of this and try to twist, and you guys are going to notice that the tire is flexing a little bit, but that wheel is completely seized to that axle. Alright, so I have the coil hooked up to the Venom HP. I've depressed the button here. We're going to start getting some heat into that wheel. And just to start with, I'm not going to heat this thing up to the point where, you know, it's cooking red hot. I'm just going to try and get some heat to it. As you guys saw, that wheel is seized to that axle. So if we can just heat it up enough to the point where that outer layer there expands on the axle, then hopefully, in theory, we can get it to break free from the rust, maybe even some scoring that's in there. You guys can see a little bit of smoke maybe coming off of there. Not sure if the camera's picking that up. It's probably a little bit of penetrating oil that's starting to boil inside of that wheel, in between the wheel and the axle, and that's because my customer sprayed it fairly good with penetrating oil, and he was trying to unseize this himself. We can see all of the penetrating oil in there starting to boil. So we're clearly over the boiling point of whatever penetrating oil he was using. Really starting to smoke good now. I think I'm going to pull back on this coil here. What I also failed to mention is that there's going to be this area of the wheel that is attached to the axle on the other side. So I may hook up a preformed coil to go from the outside in, and I'm using one that is wide enough to give me a little bit of space in between that wheel and the preformed coil. Again, you know, using the bearing buddy there, the coil itself is going to be coming in contact with the metal that we're heating. You guys can see now that there's a ton of smoke coming off of this thing. I've taken some air out of the tire, not all of it because I don't want to break the bead of the tire. However, as the metal heats up, it will heat up the air inside of the tire and could over pressurize the tire, and I don't want to blow a tire. We're really starting to get the heat to it now. You guys are going to see the outer edge there is starting to cherry. We're getting a little bit of glowing, so I'm going to pull off on that. I'll try to get the Venom HP in the shot there for you guys. Go ahead and pull that back a bit. Again, the coil itself doesn't get hot, but the shaft and the wheel will, and that'll radiate heat into the coil. Once again, I'm twisting, just trying to break that wheel free. No amount of force that I'm putting on that is breaking it free. That thing is absolutely seized on there. Alright, so change of plans here. My simulating the wheel and axle still being attached to the snowblower might prove to be difficult to get a wheel off that way. So instead, we're going to imagine that we just have what we have in front of us. A wheel seized to an axle where one wheel came off, and we're going to use the preformed coil to go over the axle to the center of the wheel, try to get that heat in there. Now I don't have this in the vise. What I did was open the jaws of the vise up enough so that once I get this hot, I can take a hammer to the top of this axle and hopefully tap it down. So we may need to use a combination of the Venom HP and a little bit of impact, and I was having a little bit of trouble with the bearing buddy to get the intersection to the point where it was red hot, because you have to remember that you really don't want the coil touching the metal that you're heating up, because again you're going to burn away your protective heat wrap on that coil. See if we can get it moving. What do you think, guys? Hole looks farther away from the wheel. It appears as if we're getting it moving. So I think I'll flip the wheel now, heat it from this side, and then hammer it back down that way. If we can get that axle in there moving up and down, even if it's just 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch, then we can reheat it, and maybe I can try my twisting method and see if we can get it freed up that way. I put a little bit of penetrating oil in there, hopefully help it along. Trying not to cool the metal down too much. I know some guys like to use the quench technique, which is going to be to heat up a piece of steel that's seized, and then you dunk it into like a tank of water, and then the shock from it going from hot to cold is sometimes enough to break it free. But in this case, I'm just going to try and hammer this thing back and forth and A lot of my videos, I know how they're going to end when I start, but for this one, you guys are just kind of along for the ride here. We're going to see what works and what doesn't work. Check it out. That looks like progress to me, guys. Alright, so I've decided to use a smaller preformed coil, hopefully to more concentrate the magnetic field in here. I don't want to burn up a coil, but I got to get this thing to the point where it's hot throughout, because at the center of the wheel there's going to be a very small area that I'm just not going to be able to get heat to, and I don't know if you guys can hear that, but the metal is tinging pretty good. Alright, so a little bit more heat and we'll keep hammering away at it. Might be difficult for you guys to see from there, but that thing is glowing hot. Try and hit it again. Moved quite a bit there. So as you guys can see, we are absolutely making progress to this. I've got it moving. Still cannot rotate this thing. It's just won't go. And it could be because as I'm hammering it up and down, it may be scoring the shaft and the inner side of that wheel to the point where, you know, it's grabbing and it just doesn't want to spin. It just wants to move up and down. That's fine, because as I said, I'm just going to keep going back and forth to the point where I can get this thing freed up enough to where I can spin it. You guys might be able to hear it clicking and tinging there. I'm getting this thing pretty hot using induction heat. When I put that preformed coil on here, only the wheel is getting red hot. The axle is not, and that's exactly what we want. We want to heat that wheel up to the point where it expands, and then we can drive the shaft out from the wheel. And we're just doing what we can. Obviously, you guys might see there, we are deforming the ends of the shaft. That's going to be okay. I can always hammer them back down and then go and take a file to clean up those edges. I can use one of my bushings just to test fit once I do that, to make sure that the shaft is the correct size, because once I get this close enough to the point where I think I can hammer it straight out, then I'll have to make sure that the edges are all cleaned up. Alright, so a little bit of penetrating oil here. I've offset the wheel, and let's see if we can tap the shaft through. It's moving nicely now. Oh, that is really nice. See if I can get this thing to rotate now. Tighten this down here. Like I said, you guys are along for the journey. Check that out. Induction Innovations Mini-Ductor Venom HP. You guys can see the shaft is not spinning. The wheel is, and it's moving up and down on the shaft freely now. We're getting a nice rotation because we've broken it free from the rust and all the burrs. The problem is, you guys might not get a good shot of it there, because I've been hammering the top of the shaft. We've mushroomed the head. So what I'm going to do now is just take my file and just try to clean it up as best I can, and then, like I said, I'll use one of my bushings just as a guide, and then as soon as that bushing goes on nice and smooth, we should be able to pull this wheel straight off. Now, you don't want to file the end of the shaft too much. Obviously, we just want to get to the point where the bushing slides on and off, and now we should be able to take the wheel right off of the axle. Check that out. So in this case, with the help of the Mini-Ductor Venom HP, we were able to save the wheel and save the axle. There is not too much damage to the wheel, obviously a little bit, because that's the area that we were putting on the vise as we were hammering the axle down. All right, so with a little bit of emery paper and my file, I now have the shaft cleaned up to the point where the bushing goes all the way across it. Went ahead and filed around the holes that go through the shaft to take those burrs off as well. And this shaft with the tire is ready to go back to my customer. Just wanted to give my friend Doug a shout out for sending this axle and wheel assembly over so that I could do a video on getting this thing unseized, as well as big shout out to Induction Innovations for sending over this Mini-Ductor Venom HP induction heating tool. Couldn't have gotten that wheel unseized from that axle without it. And to prevent something like this from happening in the future, because it did take me quite a while to get this one unseized, some come off easier than others, I can assure you. As I said before, I've had to use even hydraulic presses to press out axles from seized wheels, no matter how much heat you put to them. So we may have gotten lucky today, but to prevent that from happening again, you want to use some anti-seize. Doesn't matter what kind it is, you just want to make sure that the wheel does not seize to the shaft so that you guys don't have to go through this process on your snowblower. Well, that's going to be it for today's video. If you guys enjoyed the video, think about leaving me a thumbs up. You know, it really helps me out. You can click here to subscribe and click over here to watch one of my previous videos. I upload every single week, so be sure to stop on by next week. Check the channel out for new content. And as always, guys, thanks for watching.